My mother-in-law called me on a Thursday morning, and her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, which was something close to stunned, and she said, "Isabelle, I'm looking at something on my phone," and I said, "What are you looking at, Helen?" And she said, "An article," and I said, "What kind of article?" And she said, "The kind with your photograph in it," and I said, "What does it say?" And she went quiet for a moment, and then she said, "It says you're on the Forbes list," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "The Forbes list." And I said, "Yes, Helen," and she said, "Isabelle, how?" And I said, "I built a company," and she said, "I didn't know you had a company," and I said, "I know you didn't." And the line was quiet for a long time, and I sat at the desk in the office of the company I had been building for 6 years, and I thought about the evening 3 years into my marriage when I had sat at Helen's dining room table and overheard her telling her sister that she had always suspected Isabelle was more interested in what the family had than in what Thomas was. And I had sat with my dinner fork in my hand, and I had not said anything, and I had made a decision that evening that I was not going to defend myself against an accusation that my work would eventually disprove more completely than any argument I could have made at that table. And Helen was calling me from a Forbes article 3 years later, and I thought, yes, and I thought, this is exactly what I meant. Hey everyone, welcome back. And you know what? If you are brand new here today, I think you chose a really good entry point because this story ends with a phone call that I've been waiting to receive for 3 years, and I want to walk you through every single thing that built up to it. So, stay with me. My name is Isabelle Fontaine, and I am 34 years old, and I have been married to my husband Thomas for 5 years. And Thomas's family has money in the specific way that some families have money, which is that it has been there long enough that they have stopped thinking about it as something that was built and started thinking about it as something that simply exists. And families like that have a particular sensitivity to the people who marry into them, and whether those people are marrying the family or marrying the money. And my mother-in-law Helen had decided before I attended my second family dinner that I was marrying the money, and she had been telling people this in the careful language of concern. For 3 years, Helen's version of her concern sounded like this. At a family gathering 8 months into our relationship, she had said to Thomas within my hearing that she hoped he was being careful, and Thomas had said careful about what, Mom? And she had said about what people want from you, and Thomas had said Isabelle doesn't want anything from me. Mom and Helen had said, I'm sure she doesn't mean to. And Thomas had said, Mom and Helen had said, I just love you and I want to make sure. And I had been in the next room getting a glass of water, and I had heard all of it, and I had come back and sat down, and I had talked about something else entirely. And Thomas had looked at me, and I had looked at him, and I had shaken my head slightly, which meant not now, and he had nodded, which meant okay. And that pattern had continued for 3 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, and the occasional pointed comment from Helen about how fortunate it was that Thomas was so generous and how lovely that Isabelle was able to focus on her, work with so much support, and every one of those comments was shaped to communicate a version of me that I was not, and I had let them land without correcting them because I had decided the correction was going to come from somewhere other than my own mouth. What Helen did not know about my work, and what I had never explained at a family dinner, was the specific shape of what I had been building since I was 26 years old, which was a software company that provided data analytics tools to mid-size healthcare organizations. And I had started it with a co-founder named Priya, who had the technical background I lacked, and I had the business development background she lacked. And together we had spent 2 years building a product and 3 more years growing a client base, and by year 5, we had 42 enterprise clients and a revenue run rate that had attracted serious investor interest. And I had gone through a Series B funding round in year 5 that had valued the company at a number that surprised even me. And by year 6, we were preparing for a potential acquisition process that was ongoing, and that had produced the Forbes coverage, which was part of a feature on women founders in healthcare technology. And my photograph was in it, and my name was in it, and a description of what I had built was in it. And Helen had seen it on a Thursday morning and called me. I want to be honest about why I had never told Helen about the company in any specific way, because I think the honesty is more interesting than the drama. And the honest reason was two parts, and the first part was that I had learned within the first year of knowing Helen that information shared with Helen became information processed through Helen's existing assumptions about me, and I had not wanted the company to be processed through the assumption that I was with Thomas for his money, because that assumption would have produced a version of my work that was either competitive with Thomas's family wealth in some weird zero-sum way, or would have been disbelieved as exaggerated, and neither of those outcomes was useful. And the second part was that Thomas had known from the beginning. He had been one of the first people I told about the company when we were dating, and he had been genuinely supportive from year one, and he had never told his family the specifics because I had asked him not to, and he had respected that completely for 5 years. And I want to say clearly that Thomas's quiet support during 5 years of his mother's implication was a more significant act of partnership than I think he realizes. And I told him so on the Thursday of the Forbes call, and he said, "I know what you built, Isabelle, I've always known." And I said, "I know you have." The Forbes article had been in process for 4 months before publication, and I had known it was coming, and I had not told Thomas's family it was coming because I had decided, for the same reasons I had kept everything else quiet, that the article's arrival should not be preceded by my announcement of its arrival, and the article should simply arrive and be what it was without any framing from me, and it had arrived on a Thursday morning, and Helen had seen it and called me, and the call had lasted 47 minutes, which was longer than any conversation Helen and I had ever had. And in those 47 minutes, Helen had asked me questions that she had never asked me in 5 years of family dinners, and I had answered all of them honestly and in detail, because she was finally asking, and asking deserves answering. And by the end of the call, Helen had a more accurate picture of who I was and what I had built than she had constructed in 5 years of assumptions. And I want to be clear that the picture was not complete in 47 minutes, because 5 years of assumptions do not dissolve in one phone call. But the call was the beginning of something more honest, and I think that matters more than the Forbes placement. Helen came to dinner the following Sunday, and she brought flowers, which she had not done before. And she sat at the table and she asked Thomas about his work, and she asked me about the acquisition process, and she asked real questions and listened to real answers. And at the end of the evening, she said, "Isabelle, I owe you an apology." And I said, "Helen, I appreciate that." And she said, "I said things that were unfair." And I said, "I know you did." And she said, "I was protecting Thomas the way I thought I should be." And I said, "I understand that impulse, Helen." And I said, "The most useful thing you can do now is ask better questions going forward." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "And if you have a question about who I am or what I want, you can ask me directly." And she said, "I will." And she has, twice in the months since. And both times I answered her, and both times I think she believed me. And I think we are building something different than what we had for 5 years. And I think it is more honest, and I think Thomas is relieved in a way that he had been too kind to say out loud. And I think the Forbes list was not what changed things. What changed things was Helen finally being forced by a piece of journalism to see me clearly enough to ask a question. And I had been waiting for that question for 5 years, and it turns out 47 minutes was enough to begin answering it.